So the Cooler Master Masterliquid Maker 92. Whew, that was a mouthful. What this is Cooler Master's very unique cooler that somewhat bridges the gap between the traditional all-in-one cooler and the tower air cooler. Which it's really interesting what they did here. They developed an all-in-one cooler that mounts the same way that you would a traditional air tower and allows for some really unique twists. Let's take a closer look at the cooler itself. It comes packaged very sparsely, featuring just the mounts for Intel, and that's for a reason. This cooler only supports the Intel socket 1150 series, being 1150, 1151, 1155, those sockets, as well as socket 2011 and 2011 V3. Now, that does leave AMD owners out in the dust a little bit with this, but I have seen some people modify it to work. But that's, that's for the modders out there. But the traditional person picking this up off the shelf, you're going to have to skip if you're an AMD user. Now, taking a look at the cooler itself, it's really neat the way it works. We've got a pair of 92mm fans attached, a slim, dense fan-packed radiator with push-pull 92mm fans. Big drawback here is these are proprietary fans to this cooler, and you're not going to be able to swap them out. So yeah, well, the good thing is they are good fans and they are rather quiet. The pump for the cold plate is actually on the top of the radiator, and that radiator does swivel. It rotates down from a vertical to a horizontal position, allowing for cooling across motherboard components such as VRMs, memory, and the socket itself. A lot of these components are typically left out in the cold, I guess you could say, with the traditional all-in-one cooler where the radiator is mounted away from the socket, and that usually leaves very little airflow around. Now, mounting this to our test system that we used, which by the way is a Z170 Stinger board from EVGA with a Core i5 6600K that we did overclock, and we'll get to that just in a bit, but mounting it to this was fairly simple. We had to set up the back plate, which was just a couple pins, and you mounted it through the motherboard just like a lot of all-in-one coolers would do. However, the biggest drawback with this is the thumb screws that secure the cooler to the board and the CPU were just a bit hard to get to on one side where the inlet and outlet for the cooler were for the cold plate. So it didn't really made things a little bit difficult, especially whenever I had to remove the cooler at one point because I left the sticker on the cold plate. So doing that while it was in the case was extremely difficult. So once we put it in here, we were actually able to fit this on our Z170 board and get it into the EVGA Hadron air case. Not the Hadron Hydro, but the air case, so the smaller one that pretty much does not support water cooling unless you pull out the Dremel and make quite a few modifications. That out of the way, we've managed to get the i5 6600K overclocked to 4.6 gigahertz at 1.35 volts, which is on this particular setup. Prior to this, I had a Cooler Master Hyper TX3 Evo cooler in there, and the highest we could get it was 4.2, and that was pushing it, and it was screaming like a banshee. So backed it down to 4 gigahertz, and it was still running up into the mid 60 Celsius temperature marks. But now that we've got it in there, I'm going to back out, and we're going to take a look at the video that we made while we were testing this cooler after running it at those clock speeds for over 15 minutes, and then I stopped it and started it back up for the recording to see where the temperatures lie. Let's take a look at that, and we'll get right back to the conclusion. So here we are after a couple minutes of IDA 64 Extreme running the Stress CPU, Stress FPU, and Stress Cache. Now we've done this test before just to verify, but this is the second time around, and these are about the same temperatures we hit before. Again, 4.6 gigahertz at 1.35 volts on a Core i5 6600K in the tiny little EVGA Hadron Air case. Typically, again, water cooling wouldn't fit in this without heavy modification, but we've got it here with no problem, and we are maintaining sub 80C across the board. Now we're getting close, we're closely approaching 80C, but the fact is that's 4.6 gigahertz and with that voltage on this tiny of a case. Now I'm going to move the camera over here a little bit. We'll get our lights going. We'll zoom back in. We'll get it. All right, so here we are with the cooler. Now what I'm going to do is unclip my microphone. So it's unclipped here, and we're actually going to move it down to right here in front of it so you can see how it sounds. All right, guys, so there you see it. Under 80C, 4.6 gigahertz in that form factor. I know a lot of people are going to see that and be like, oh my God, 80C, what, you know, my 240 mil, you're right. That's where the thing is with this cooler comes in. It's extremely great for specific use cases. It's not the everyman's cooler. If you've got a smaller case, something like the Hadron, something like the Rygen Metis or a Thermaltake Core V1, something along those lines that you would have to mount a radiator some really funny way, and maybe newcomers aren't really that comfortable with doing that. Or if you're somebody who the cooling is like the cooling performance is adequate, but you'd really like to keep your motherboard components cool as well. That's something to take into consideration. I think Cooler Master's made a really good product here, and no, we didn't review this in the traditional sense because quite frankly, this is a very unique product and there's not a whole lot of other things to compare it to, because if you compare it to a traditional air tower cooler, well, you couldn't fit the air tower cooler in something like the EVGA Hadron. But if you wanted to compare it to something like something like a C-class cooler from like Noctua, well, you can't rotate that. So it's extremely unique in what it is. So if you found this interesting or informative, feel free to leave us a subscribe and a like, and we'll catch you guys all in the next video.